At 06:15 on the morning of August 21, 1942, Colonel Ichiki stood at the edge of a coconut grove on Guadalcanal. Ahead of him stretched a narrow sandbar, pale in the first light of dawn. Beyond it, hidden in darkness, waited the American line. Ichiki had 917 men behind him, elite infantry, veterans of China and Southeast Asia, soldiers who had never known defeat. They had been taught that Western armies collapsed under pressure, that Americans lacked the will to fight at close range, that no amount of firepower could compensate for spiritual weakness. Ichiki believed it completely. When his men crossed that sandbar, he expected the Marines to run. They did not. By the end of the day, nearly 800 Japanese soldiers would be dead, and everything Japan believed about American fighting men would begin to fall apart. The confidence that carried Colonel Ichiki to the sandbar did not come from arrogance alone. It came from doctrine. For decades, Japanese military thinking had been built around a single, unshakable idea: Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan. It was more than patriotism, more than loyalty. It was the belief that Japanese soldiers possessed a spiritual strength no Western army could match. Where other nations relied on machines, Japan relied on will. Where others measured strength in steel and numbers, Japan measured it in sacrifice. This belief reached deep into history. Japanese mythology taught that the people were descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. The emperor was not merely a ruler, but a living link between the nation and the divine. To fight for him was not simply duty. It was sacred. By the early 20th century, this idea had become the foundation of Japanese military culture. Officers were taught that moral strength decided battles long before bullets were fired, that a soldier willing to die would always defeat one who feared death. In 1905, the Russo-Japanese War appeared to prove it beyond question. A small island nation defeated a vast European empire. Russian armies, backed by industry and modern weapons, collapsed before Japanese forces that fought with relentless determination. The victory shocked the world and confirmed everything Japanese leaders believed about themselves. They had not won because they were richer. They had not won because they were better equipped. They had won because their spirit was stronger. From that moment on, Yamato Damashi hardened into doctrine. By the 1930s, Japanese officers were taught that Western societies produced weak soldiers, men raised in comfort, men who valued individual survival over collective honor, men who would not stand when the situation became desperate. Americans, in particular, were seen as dangerously soft. They lived well. They lacked discipline. They had no tradition of sacrifice. Japanese planners believed that when confronted with sudden violence, with night attacks, bayonet charges, and the willingness to die, Americans would lose their nerve. They would withdraw. They would surrender. They would run. Early victories in the Pacific seemed to confirm it, and with each success, belief became certainty. By 1942, Yamato Damashi was no longer questioned. It was assumed. When war came to the Pacific, events seemed to unfold exactly as Japanese planners had predicted. In December 1941, Japanese forces struck across Southeast Asia with speed and precision. Everywhere they advanced, Western defenses collapsed faster than expected. In the Philippines, American and Filipino troops fell back again and again. Positions meant to hold for months were overrun in weeks. By the spring of 1942, tens of thousands of prisoners marched into captivity. Bataan and Corregidor became symbols not of resistance, but of defeat. At Singapore, the British Empire suffered one of the greatest humiliations in its history. More than 80,000 Allied troops surrendered to a Japanese force far smaller than their own. The fortress that had been called impregnable fell with shocking speed. In Hong Kong, in Malaya, in the Dutch East Indies, the pattern repeated itself. Japanese troops attacked aggressively, accepted losses without hesitation, and pressed forward where others might have paused. Colonial armies that had ruled for generations crumbled under the strain. To Japanese commanders, the lesson seemed obvious. Western soldiers depended on supply lines, heavy equipment, and careful planning. When those things failed, their will collapsed with them. Even when Americans fought hard, Japanese officers explained it away. At Wake Island, a small Marine garrison resisted far longer than expected, inflicting heavy losses before surrendering. But Japanese reports dismissed the battle as an exception. The Marines had nowhere to retreat. They had fought only because escape was impossible. The conclusion remained unchanged. American troops lacked endurance. They lacked discipline. They lacked the spiritual strength to endure sustained combat. This belief extended specifically to the United States Marine Corps. Japanese intelligence viewed the Marines as a minor force, poorly equipped, inexperienced, and irrelevant to modern warfare. They had not fought a serious enemy since the First World War. Their interwar service consisted largely of small colonial conflicts, not major battles against determined opponents. There was nothing in the Marine Corps' record, Japanese planners believed, that suggested it could stand against the Imperial Army. Each early victory reinforced the same conviction. If Americans were pressured hard enough, they would give way. If attacked at night, they would panic. If faced with soldiers willing to die, they would break. By the summer of 1942, this belief was no longer theory. It was evidence, and it shaped every decision that followed. On August 7, 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Japanese were caught completely off guard. The island was lightly defended. Construction crews and a small security detachment fled into the jungle as American naval guns thundered offshore. By nightfall, the Marines had achieved their primary objective. They had seized the unfinished Japanese airfield. It would soon be named Henderson Field. The landing itself had gone almost too smoothly. There had been no massed resistance, no desperate counterattacks. To many of the Marines, it felt unreal. They had trained for disaster and found none. But Guadalcanal was not won by landing on it. It was won by holding it. Only hours after the Marines came ashore, the balance began to shift. On the night of August 8th, a Japanese naval force slipped undetected through the darkness near Savo Island. In a matter of minutes, 4 Allied cruisers were sunk. More than 1,000 sailors were killed in one of the worst naval defeats in American history. The shock was immediate. Fearing the loss of his aircraft carriers, the American naval commander withdrew his fleet. The transports left with him, taking with them much of the Marines' heavy equipment, ammunition, and food. What could not be unloaded in time was gone. The Marines were furious. They had captured the airfield and then been left behind to defend it alone. When the last ships disappeared over the horizon, the reality became clear. They were isolated, they were undersupplied, and reinforcements were not coming. Vandergrift's division now faced an impossible task. They had to finish the airfield, establish a defensive perimeter, and prepare for a counterattack, all with limited ammunition and dwindling rations. They dug into the volcanic soil with whatever tools they had. They scavenged captured Japanese supplies. They ate rice meant for the enemy. They worked under constant heat, humidity, and disease. The jungle was as dangerous as the Japanese. Malaria spread quickly. Dysentery followed. Men collapsed from exhaustion while aircraft circled overhead, probing for weakness. Still, the Marines held. By August 20th, the first American aircraft landed on Henderson Field, the beginning of what would soon be called the Cactus Air Force. But before those planes could change the balance, the Japanese were already on their way. Colonel Ichiki arrived on Guadalcanal on the night of August 19th. He brought with him 917 men of the 28th Infantry Regiment, one of the most highly trained units in the Imperial Japanese Army. These soldiers had been prepared for the assault on Midway. They were meant to spearhead a decisive victory. Instead, they had been redirected south toward an island Japanese planners believed was already lost. Ichiki had been ordered to wait. The rest of his regiment was still at sea, moving slowly toward Guadalcanal on transport ships. His instructions were clear. Establish a beachhead, hold position, attack only when reinforced. Ichiki ignored them. Japanese aerial reconnaissance had reported little activity around Henderson Field. A senior staff officer had flown over the marine perimeter days earlier and seen almost nothing. From the air, it appeared abandoned. Imperial headquarters concluded that the Americans had withdrawn most of their forces, leaving behind only a token garrison. Ichiki believed it completely. Even if the reports were wrong, he was certain it would not matter. His men were veterans. The Marines were not. A single decisive night attack would be enough to sweep them into the sea. Waiting would only dilute the honor of victory. So Ichiki left a small rear guard at the landing site and began marching inland almost immediately. His column moved quickly through the jungle, confident and undisturbed. They expected resistance. They did not expect preparation. What Ichiki did not know was that the Marines were watching. Coast watchers and native scouts had tracked his movements from the moment he landed. Messages moved quietly through the perimeter. Machine gun crews rehearsed fields of fire. Artillery batteries registered targets along likely approaches. The Marines didn't know how many Japanese were coming, but they knew an attack was inevitable. As night fell on August 20th, Ichiki prepared to deliver the blow he believed would end the battle for Guadalcanal. He was certain the Marines would break. He was wrong. Shortly after midnight on August 21st, the jungle around the Marine perimeter went silent. Then, just before the attack began, a single man emerged from the darkness. He was wounded, barely able to stand. His body was covered in blood. His name was Jacob Vuza, a coast watcher and former police sergeant. Japanese soldiers had captured him while he was scouting inland. They had tortured him, stabbed him repeatedly, and left him tied to a tree to die. He did not die. Vuza crawled through the jungle for miles, bleeding and half-conscious, until he reached the Marine lines. With what strength he had left, he delivered a warning. The Japanese were coming. They were close. The attack was imminent. Minutes later, Ichiki struck. At approximately 01:30, Japanese infantry surged forward across the sandbar at the mouth of Alligator Creek. They came screaming battle cries, bayonets fixed, charging straight into the darkness. This was how it was supposed to end. Night attacks had broken Chinese armies. They had shattered British and colonial units. The psychological shock alone was usually enough, but when the Japanese reached the creek, they found Marines waiting. Machine guns opened fire at point-blank range. Tracers ripped through the assault waves. Men fell into the shallow water by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Artillery shells slammed into the sandbar with devastating precision, tearing apart formations before they could regroup. Still, the Japanese kept coming. Some reached the Marine lines and fought hand to hand. Rifles became clubs. Bayonets flashed in the dark. The fighting was brutal, chaotic, and close. The Marines did not run. They did not panic. They held. One Marine machine gunner was wounded early in the battle, blinded by shrapnel. Guided by his assistant, he continued firing through the night, adjusting his aim by sound alone. By dawn, the attack had collapsed. Ichiki's men lay scattered across the sandbar and the jungle beyond it. Hundreds were dead. The survivors were exhausted, disoriented, and trapped. As the sun rose, the Marines counterattacked. They crossed the creek upstream, swung around the Japanese flank, and closed the trap. Light tanks rolled forward into the coconut grove, machine guns blazing. There was no escape. Some Japanese soldiers fought to the last bullet. Some charged the tanks with bayonets. Others took their own lives rather than surrender. By late afternoon, the battle was over. Of the 917 men Ichiki had brought ashore, nearly 800 were dead. Marine losses were fewer than 40 killed. The exchange was staggering. It was not supposed to happen. Ichiki burned his regimental colors to prevent their capture. Shortly afterward, he was dead. Whether by his own hand or in the final fighting remains unclear. What was clear was this: a Japanese infantry regiment had been annihilated by American Marines, and no one in Tokyo was prepared to believe it. When news of the battle reached Rabaul, Japanese commanders refused to believe it. The reports made no sense. A full infantry regiment could not simply disappear, not against American Marines, not in a single night. The first assumption was error. Perhaps Ichiki had attacked the wrong position. Perhaps the terrain had been misunderstood. Perhaps casualties had been exaggerated. Anything was more acceptable than the truth. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo reacted the same way. The defeat was so unexpected that it was dismissed almost immediately. Ichiki had not failed because the enemy was strong. He had failed because he had used too few men. That was the conclusion. No fundamental reassessment followed, no questioning of doctrine, no reconsideration of what Tenaru had revealed about American fighting capability. Instead, Japanese commanders doubled down. The Marines were still believed to be brittle. The shock at Tenaru was treated as an anomaly, an unfortunate mistake that could be corrected with proper force. The solution was obvious. Send more troops. Orders were issued for a larger, better coordinated offensive. Veteran units were reassigned, supplies were gathered, plans were drawn for a decisive blow that would finally sweep the Americans off Guadalcanal. This time, there would be no piecemeal attacks, no isolated detachments, no embarrassment. The belief remained intact. American Marines could not withstand sustained pressure. What had happened at Tenaru was not a warning. It was dismissed as noise, and with that decision, Japan set itself on a path that would cost far more than a single regiment. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi arrived on Guadalcanal in early September with a reputation to protect. Unlike Ichiki, Kawaguchi was not impulsive. He was experienced, methodical, and respected within the Imperial Army. He had studied the failure at Tenaru carefully and reached a different conclusion. The Marines had not won because they were superior soldiers. They had won because Ichiki had attacked head-on. Kawaguchi believed that mistake would not be repeated. His plan was simple in theory. Instead of striking the Marine perimeter directly, his force would march deep through the jungle, approach Henderson Field from the south, and attack from high ground the Americans believed was impassable. It was an ambitious maneuver. The terrain was brutal. There were no roads, no reliable maps. Dense jungle swallowed entire units. Torrential rain turned trails into rivers. Supply columns lagged behind or disappeared altogether. Men carried everything on their backs: weapons, ammunition, food. Artillery pieces were dragged by hand through mud and undergrowth, often abandoned when exhaustion made movement impossible. The march took far longer than planned. Units became separated. Timetables collapsed. Soldiers arrived at their assembly areas malnourished, dehydrated, and already exhausted before the battle had even begun. Still, Kawaguchi pressed forward. He believed that hardship strengthened spirit, that endurance itself was proof of superiority. The suffering of his men did not weaken the plan. It validated it. Japanese intelligence continued to underestimate the Marines. Reports suggested the American defenses were thin. Morale was assumed to be poor. Henderson Field, Kawaguchi believed, was vulnerable to a determined blow. What he did not fully understand was how much the Marines had changed since Tenaru. They no longer waited passively, behind static lines. They patrolled aggressively. They improved their defenses every night. They learned the terrain, mapped the jungle, and prepared fallback positions. They expected another attack. As Kawaguchi's forces struggled through the jungle, Marine scouts detected movement. Artillery observers identified likely avenues of approach. Commanders shifted reserves quietly into position. The ground Kawaguchi intended to seize had no name yet. It would soon, and it would decide the fate of Guadalcanal. On the night of September 12, 1942, Kawaguchi finally launched his attack. His objective was a narrow line of high ground south of Henderson Field, a broken coral ridge the Marines had fortified only days earlier. It was an unlikely position, steep, exposed, and difficult to supply. But if the Japanese took it, Henderson Field would fall. The Marines defending the ridge belonged to the 1st Raider Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson. They knew what was coming. As darkness settled over the jungle, Japanese artillery opened fire. Mortar rounds crashed into the ridge, trees splintered, the ground shook. Then the shelling stopped, and the infantry came. Wave after wave surged out of the darkness. They attacked uphill, screaming, firing from the hip, closing the distance as fast as they could. The Marines answered with rifle fire, machine guns, and grenades, fighting by muzzle flash and sound alone. The ridge became chaos. Units intermingled, lines bent and broke. In several places, Japanese soldiers punched through the Marine defenses, forcing small groups to fall back toward the crest. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. Edson moved constantly along the ridge, rallying men, redirecting fire, pulling survivors together into new defensive knots. At one point, he ordered the line pulled back deliberately, trading ground for cohesion, refusing to let panic turn retreat into collapse. The Japanese pressed harder. They believed they were winning. They believed the Marines were finally breaking. They were wrong. Marine artillery, firing at minimum elevation, poured shells directly onto the slopes below the ridge. Forward observers called fire so close that explosions showered their own positions with dirt and fragments. Still, the attacks continued. By dawn on September 14th, the ridge was carpeted with bodies. Japanese soldiers lay piled in front of Marine positions, some so close they could be reached by hand. The Marines were exhausted. Many had not slept in days. Ammunition was dangerously low. Casualties mounted steadily. But the line held. When daylight fully revealed the battlefield, the scale of the Japanese losses became undeniable. Entire assault companies had ceased to exist. Officers were dead. Units had lost cohesion and direction. Kawaguchi's force began to pull back. The ridge remained in American hands. Later, it would be renamed Bloody Ridge. It marked the closest Japan ever came to retaking Henderson Field by ground assault. It was also the moment when a pattern became impossible to ignore. Japanese courage had not failed. Japanese discipline had not failed. What had failed was the belief that spirit alone could overcome firepower, preparation, and adaptation. The Marines had not been swept aside. They had learned, and they were not going anywhere. By October, Japanese command accepted that Guadalcanal could not be retaken by piecemeal attacks. This time, there would be no half measures. General Harukichi Hyakutake committed nearly 20,000 men to the operation. It was the largest ground force Japan had yet assembled on the island. The plan was direct and uncompromising, a massive coordinated assault that would crush the Marine perimeter and recapture Henderson Field once and for all. Once again, Japanese troops marched through the jungle. Once again, the terrain punished them. Men arrived at their starting positions, starving, weakened by disease, carrying only a fraction of the supplies they needed. Units were delayed, disoriented, and out of position before the battle even began. Still, the order was given. On the night of October 23rd, Japanese forces attacked along the entire perimeter. They came in waves. Some assaults struck the southern defenses, others probed the western sector. Everywhere, Japanese infantry advanced with the same determination that had carried them across Asia. And everywhere, they were met by prepared Marines. Machine guns cut down attack columns before they could close. Artillery pounded jungle approaches that Japanese planners believed concealed their movements. Defensive lines bent, but did not break. At one point, a small Marine position came under relentless assault by an entire Japanese battalion. At the center of that defense was Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone. As ammunition ran low and guns jammed under constant fire, Basilone moved repeatedly through open ground to keep his weapons running. He repaired machine guns under fire, redistributed ammunition by hand, and held the line through the night. When morning came, the ground in front of his position was littered with bodies. The October offensive collapsed in the same way the earlier attacks had, not suddenly, not dramatically, but completely. Japanese units withdrew in fragments. Officers were gone. Cohesion vanished. Survivors melted back into the jungle. For the first time, Japanese commanders could no longer deny what they were seeing. The Marines were not breaking. They were adapting faster than Japan could, and Guadalcanal was slipping beyond reach. After the failure of the October offensive, the battle for Guadalcanal changed character. Japan no longer fought to win the island. It fought to survive on it. American control of Henderson Field made daylight movement almost impossible. Japanese transport ships were driven away or destroyed from the air. Supplies that did get through arrived only at night, in small quantities, unloaded in haste, never enough. The island began to starve. Japanese soldiers weakened rapidly. Malnutrition set in first, then disease. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion swept through the ranks. Men collapsed during marches. Others were too weak to carry their weapons. Food shortages became desperate. Rice rations vanished. Soldiers survived on coconuts, roots, and whatever could be scavenged from the jungle. Units that once prided themselves on discipline now struggled simply to remain upright. Morale followed the body. Officers reported men unable to fight, units no longer capable of coordinated action. Attacks were canceled not because of enemy resistance, but because soldiers physically could not advance. American artillery and patrols tightened the pressure. Every movement was observed. Every attempt to reorganize was disrupted. By November, the truth was unavoidable. Guadalcanal could not be held. The island earned a new name among the Japanese ranks: Starvation Island. In February 1943, under the cover of darkness, Japan evacuated what remained of its forces. Thousands were saved, but the best units of the Imperial Army had been shattered beyond repair. What had begun as a confident campaign ended in quiet withdrawal, not defeated by lack of courage, but by reality. Guadalcanal ended without ceremony. There was no final charge, no decisive battlefield triumph, only empty jungle and abandoned positions. Yet what Japan lost on that island was far greater than territory. For decades, Japanese military thought had rested on a single certainty: that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage, that soldiers willing to die would always defeat those who feared death, that courage, discipline, and sacrifice were decisive in themselves. On Guadalcanal, that idea met an enemy who did not behave as expected. The Marines did not collapse. Under pressure, they did not retreat when attacked at night. They did not break when cut off, sick, hungry, and exhausted. Instead, they adapted. They learned the terrain. They coordinated fire. They replaced doctrine with experience. Japanese commanders did not lose because their soldiers lacked courage. Few armies in history fought with greater resolve. They lost because belief became rigidity, because lessons were dismissed, because warnings were ignored, because an idea was protected long after reality had proven it wrong. After Guadalcanal, Japanese commanders would fight on, with skill, with bravery, with desperation. But something fundamental had changed. They now faced an enemy who would not flee, who would not surrender, who could absorb punishment and respond with precision. Guadalcanal marked the moment Japan realized the war would not be short, and the moment the Imperial Army learned that belief alone could no longer carry it forward. An island had been lost, but more importantly, an illusion had died. If you found this story worth remembering, take a moment to acknowledge the men who fought here, on both sides, and the cost of the beliefs they carried into battle. Guadalcanal is often remembered as a campaign of ships and aircraft, but it was also a battle of ideas, of assumptions tested, of certainty confronted by reality. If you have thoughts on this, or if this story changed how you see the Pacific War, feel free to share them below. And if you want to keep exploring the moments where history quietly turned, you're welcome to join us.